next one is a whole again. So whole, whole, half, whole, whole. Now what's the next one going to be? Well, it's a whole step, so it's not going to be that note, it's going to be this one. And the last note is a half a step away. So with this formula, you can play the major scale easily in any key you start in, because you know the formula. Whole, whole, half. See the relationship there? That's only a half a step away. It could be a bit confusing at first because there's no black key in the middle, but in fact, any immediate neighbor is always a half step away from its neighbor. Just think of it that way. All these notes are half a step away from each neighboring note. So we're not playing them. We're not going to play each half step because that would be a chromatic scale, as I indicated earlier. Chromatic meaning all. We're playing every note, all 12 tones. Not too many songs are built on a chromatic scale, but it's used to embellish a song. Like you might play a blues, like so in a blues song, you would have your bass. We'll just count it in a 1, 2, 3, 4. So 1, 2, 3, 4. We're still on the 1. Now we're going up to the 4. Go back to the 1. Now we're going to go up to the 5. Back to the 4. And back to the root 1. Notice that I had to play this note in there to get it to work, because in the key of G major, when we use our formula of whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half, this note has to be played as part of the major scale because it's a whole from this one before the final note, the half note. So when I'm improvising, I'm using this G scale when I'm starting on G. When the key is G, I must take note of the G scale, the notes that make up that scale. For simplicity's sake, I mean, there's many more options available for improvising, but we're going to keep it at this level right now. So whenever I'm shifting my left hand to play either the 1, 4, or 5, in this case, I'm going to play the major scale of the bass note that I'm in for my improvising notes in my right hand for the melody or the improvisational melody. What I mean by that is that when I'm just going to play a scale, the scale is going to be my improvising notes, just to keep it simple. So I'll just play the major scale. I might play with the time a little bit or in the order that I play the notes, but I'm using all the notes or the major components of that scale. Maybe I'll skip a few notes, or maybe I'll play a couple twice, but it will go. So when I get up to the 5th, I'm in a D major scale now. Now, if you look at the formula for G, or for D major, and use your formula of whole, whole, half, so you go whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. Easy as that. You just remember that. Write it down. WWWH, WWWH. WWH, WWWH. Just write that down on a piece of paper and put it on your music stand. And when you're playing scales, I'm trying to work out scales, you use that and you'll never go wrong. The only other thing you need to know at that point are how to finger each scale. And we'll just, most scales, the easier scales, I should say, with the fewer accidentals, the fewer sharps, they don't have complicated fingering. You can use the same fingering that you use in a C scale for a D scale, even though you've got two sharps in a D scale. You're still putting your thumb under after the third finger, and coming back down, you're still putting your your third finger over the thumb on the way back down. G scale, it's got one sharp. Third finger over, just like the other two scales. Now, if I was to start on something like a B flat, it's a little bit different. I sort of like to start on a different finger with the B flat. It's been so long since I've studied scales, but I mean, you could start on your second finger or your third finger on the B flat and then go thumb under. And you could do it many different ways. There's the right way and other ways. A lot of jazz musicians figure out their own fingering and they say, the heck with the classical fingering, this works better for me. So fingering is a personal choice, but I do say for the major C scale, we should stick to the thumb under after the third finger and third finger over the thumb on the way back down. It just makes it easy. So you want to practice your scales always whenever you're practicing, and practice some of your chords. I didn't talk about inversions yet. So basically inversions are just a different shape of the same chord. The chord is composed of, a triad is composed of 3 notes in the C major triad. You have your first, third, and fifth note. Now, if I wanted to make the first inversion, I would invert it by taking this note and pop it up here. So I'm playing the C, but I've decided to invert it, and instead of going here, I'm going to move it up an octave. Still playing the same 3 tones, except now the C is an octave higher. So we call that our first inversion. Second inversion, now I've got those 2 notes. What's the third note of a C? Well, you've got your first, your third, and your fifth. So I don't see how I'm going to play that note any longer. If I want to invert, that has to come up here. So I'm not going to play it like that, of course. I'm just going to move this hand up like that. So there's only 3 inversions before you get back. Well, 2 inversions. There's your root, first inversion, and second inversion. Your root tone, root because the founding tone that determines what key you're in is your root, or your sort of like your foundational tone. So now I'm going to take my root and move it up for my first inversion. Second inversion, now I'm back to my root tone. Same, except an octave apart. And to get there, I have to use the 2 inversions. There's a song that uses that, actually. It goes, it's an old 60s song called "A Walk in the Black Forest," and in part of it he goes, very common passage in classical music and in some popular music. That's a solid inversion. You can also break the inversion so that you're playing it in a flowing manner. These are all great exercises to practice over and over again until you can do them in your dreams, and they just add to your finger control and to your muscle memory. So I highly recommend practicing inversions and your scales and your broken inversions. These are also called arpeggios, although an arpeggio typically is an inversion that continues without a break, and you go sort of like a scale here. I'm going to put my thumb under. It's a bit of a stretch, so you have to sort of move your arm and your hand. Whoops. As I mentioned in another lesson, you always practice these things with rhythms to help cement your your finger action. It really helps with making sure you strike the right key. It gives you a lot more surety when you're starting to practice with rhythms, a scale. Or fours. Just count them out. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. The other thing that's good about this is that it teaches you dynamic control, so that you learn how to have apply greater or lesser finger power, striking power to each key. For instance, you have different touches that are applied in piano. You have legato, which is a very soft, even finger movement, would be. Now in legato, you want to make sure you don't release the previous note until you're sounding the second note, so that there's a continuous smooth flow between the notes. No gap. The opposite of legato is staccato. Staccato, these are terms that you'll find a lot in classical music. Staccato is the opposite, whereas you want to like bark the note. You just want to make it snappy and very brief. So a staccato scale would sound like. Or legato. Now you could practice hands together. Right hand's doing staccato, left hand's doing legato. Switch it up. Independent handwork is really important. Another good thing to practice is contrary motion. Maybe you have your two hands sufficiently trained to be able to play a C scale octaves together. Once you have that down, you could try this. You can put both thumbs on middle C and play away from each other. Practice it with in the counts of 2s and 3s. 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, so forth. So you're practicing the dynamics, plus by accenting the third note, you're increasing your muscle memory and your ability to control your finger movement. So recommend the contrary motion scale played in that fashion. And I do recommend when you practice your scales, you try to be very smooth in between the notes. Once you've got that down, then you can try the staccato. And if that gets too easy for you, then double up and do a double staccato scale. Or triple. All these little things can increase your control, which is the ultimate thing. You want to be able to have a mastery of your hands so that your brain input goes to your fingers and they behave accordingly without fighting with them to get this finger to do what you want. Remember that the two last fingers are always the weakest fingers because they have less controlling elements as opposed to these two fingers. So the left hand usually is the weakest of the two hands as well. We're a right-handed world, and most of the equipment and tools we use are catering to right-handed people. So left hand usually suffers. So that's why it's important to double down on your left hand to make sure it's not a laggard. Some of the great pianists could do anything in their left hand that they could do in their right hand. They could play melodies and passages in their left hand that it would just be stunning to most other pianists because they work so hard at it. And so you don't want to be a one-handed piano player by any means, but the left hand typically isn't going to play a lot of melodies, but sometimes it might. I tend to like to play chords and different styles of left hands. You may have like a stride style, which was popular in the 1910s, 20s, 30s, where the left hand would sort of jump around and pick a low note and then play an accompanying version of some chord. If you've got particularly large hands and big long fingers, which I don't, but I've worked for a long time to try to get a tenth. Tenth is basically that interval. It's a nice interval to be able to reach if you can do it, so that you can get that full sound, and you play like a tenth with a minor seventh in there, or actually this is a major seventh, because I'm not sounding the lower, I'm not lowering my thirds, so this is a major seventh. That would be a minor seventh. I don't want to get too far ahead of myself here, but your left hand obviously adds a lot of richness to whatever you might be playing. I mean, you could play a simple song and just play a one-note bass line, or you could play a walking bass line. A lot of times the bass line may walk. We call it a walking bass line. It just sort of uses some of the notes and walks around in conjunction with what the right hand is doing. So if I was going to do a little blues, I might go. Or I could play maybe a different style altogether and still have a blues. I could go. So your left hand obviously has lots of options when it's accompanying the right hand, and it seems overwhelming when you first start out to be able to put all those two things together, and that's why it's important to start with the two hands as soon as possible to become comfortable with the interaction and the independence. Bach was a great composer from Germany and wrote a lot of stuff that's really hard to play, and I'm not going to try to play any of it because it's something that I've completely forgotten how to play over the years. But when I did play it, I really enjoyed the fact that his left hand and his right hand worked independently, but they really complemented each other a lot, and it's very, very good to listen to some Bach if you want to put on some Bach and just have a listen to what's going on with the counterplay between the two hands. It's fascinating how that works. Well, I think I've covered a lot of ground today, and probably more than I intended. So I'm going to leave it at that. Remember, I want you to think about the relative tonalities between notes, and I want you to try to pick out those little exercises that I showed you, and I want you to sing some of the simpler songs that you remember, that you know by heart, and then try to pick them out on the keyboard. I want you to name the notes on the piano keyboard and become very familiar with them. And I want you to remember that pattern, whole, whole, half, whole, 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 half. Write it out, put it down. It should be right on your keyboard. And then I want you to apply that pattern to the starting note of each 12 tones in the scale. I'm not going to worry too much about how you finger that right now. I want you to just stumble through it at the beginning. And honestly, if you're worried about fingering any scales, just Google, let's say you want to learn the E-flat major scale fingering. Just Google E-flat major scale piano fingering, and you'll get the pattern on your device that you can use. And otherwise, just figure it out for yourself. And yeah, any feedback or anything that you want to throw back at me, I'm all ears. So I look forward to hearing from you. Have a great lesson.